Okay, welcome back to session. I just wanted to introduce our panel and also remind everyone this is a panel discussion and it's really meant for all of you to participate. So what we're going to do is we're going to just go through some ideas that each one of our panelists has prepared and we've been discussing in prior discussions prior to the meeting. Just to kind of get us started with some thinking around reproducibility. And then we really are going to open it up to discussion amongst the panel and with all of you. So I wanted to start with a little bit of discussion for why Tim and I decided to do this panel. From my own perspective, I was wondering, why do we think that the scientific literature should be reproducible, and what does it mean to be reproducible? And the fact that it really came with the advent of bioinformatics that we started believing that the things that were written in the scientific article were actually, repeatable. And this was my perspective from basic science research, where I carefully keep track of all of my data, but I never put that content into the published paper. That's content that I keep in the lab. And so when you're trying to, use the literature to help guide your research, it was never a recipe for redoing somebody else's experiments. And so I was just interested to find out historically and from different disciplines what were different perspectives on why we think science should be reproducible.
Right. So no, that's good. So I'm a computer scientist by training, and there's been a lot of work in the computer science / bioinformatics community over the last decade or so. People trying to sort of integrate research findings in various ways. And one of the interesting things that starts to come up is the notion that if we integrate all the facts about something, and let's just bracket what is a fact, if we integrate all the facts, that we'll have a much better state of knowledge. But then you get into these things like, you then get into the question of false positives in the literature, which is an actual big question. You end up drawing pathway diagrams of protein-protein interactions that have really not a diagram of what may be going on in some situation or in some organism, but of every possible interaction at any given time in any different mutated form of every different organism. So there are real issues about the numbers of false positives in the literature. There's disputes about this. There are questions about what's the standard and what should we be doing about this? And I actually this motivated me to read a reasonable amount of history of science, and then I got interested in this question. So we thought maybe there are some other people interested in this question too. And at least these panelists are, and I hope you are as well. So I'm going to introduce Anna Maria Carusi, who is from the University of Copenhagen, an associate professor in philosophy of science and technology of medicine. Is that correct? Right. Long title. Who's going to give a bit of a historical and philosophical perspective on reproducibility. Chris Drummond from NRC Canada, who is going to give some provocative remarks about reproducibility. Ian Herashkovitz, Nature Publishing Group, is going to talk a little bit about what Nature Scientific Data is doing. Professor Bernard Silverman, University of Oxford, is going to give an ethical perspective on reproducibility. Thomas Steckler from Janssen R&D. If you don't know Janssen, they're a major pharmaceutical company, and he's a pharmacologist. So big issues about transferring basic science research from the biomedical laboratories into the pharmas. And does it really work, and how often can it be done? And that raises huge reproducibility questions for people who have read the Begley and Ellis paper from Nature in 2012 and other of these things. We know that it's a sorry state of affairs in terms of transferring this research over into pharma. And last, Victoria Stodden, University of Illinois, who's a statistician by training, who's now in the information science department, is going to give her perspective. We're not going to take them in quite that order. But we did pose these questions to all the panelists. Should scholarly research really aim for reproducibility, or is there something else? And whatever that something else is, let's assume it's the ability to properly validate what's being said, to subject it to some scrutiny and some proofs of truth. Based on what's happening today, does that require any changes to the way the scholarly article is written? I think a lot of people here sort of think that it does, but let's look at what are the issues and take a little step back and get some perspective before we assume what is it that has to be changed. So I think now...
And while you're doing that, I just wanted to comment also that, you know, really the premise of this organization and our community here is, how do we get beyond the PDF, and do we need to change the scholarly article in order to communicate the types of science that we want to communicate?
Right. And so I'll now introduce Professor Carusi, my friend. And I'll also say that for those of you who went to the Bodleian today to see the first issue of Philosophical Transactions, that you might think about this, that the very first form of scientific reproducibility was reproduction of the print of the form of the article, right? To be able to not have to copy things down by hand on parchment, but to be able to print off tables of data in a reproducible way that didn't have copyist errors in them all over the place. So, carry on.
Okay, so I'm just have to say in advance that the timing issue today, and also a combination with the domestic issue at home, means that I may have to leave, and it's not because I'm finding the conversation uninteresting, it's just that I have to dash back, or I will not get back into my house tonight. So if I do leave, it's only that. I thought that I would start out, I know since we're commemorating here the 350th anniversary of the launch of the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society, I thought I'd just loop back to the beginning and to what gave rise to what we now know as, or one of the factors that gave rise to what we now know as a scientific article, which was the idea of virtual witnessing, and see what was at stake in that. And that is, so that's how do I go back?
That's why I have left arrow.
So I'm going back to Robert Boyle. Robert Boyle being one of the founders of the Royal Society, and the Royal Society and the Invisible College, the idea of the Invisible College which preceded that. The whole idea about this was to promote a new form of knowledge, and this was knowledge that was was acquired through experiment. And that was a big shift in knowledge that Boyle and others were responsible for. I'm not going to go through the whole history of that in a very, very short time. But he was really important in this shift. And the idea that what was so important about this shift is that you were shifting from a lot of theoretical disputes where there was no way to decide a matter to something to matters of fact, to things that were matters of fact and which were therefore capable of getting what was thought of as universal assent. So the big shift was from going to theoretical disputes to universal assent. And ideally, this universal assent would be acquired through some form of direct witness of experiment. So you had to be the person doing the experiment, or you had to be there in the room where the experiment was being done. This immediate access to the experiment. And that was one way, or you would replicate the experiment, do the exact same thing. And that would be one way of getting assent. Yes, if you do such and such, then you see such and such. And so then you would have some kind of assent. But the thing about, and the important thing about that is that it was a shift in knowledge because you didn't have to accept things on somebody else's say-so. You would accept it on your own authority because you had seen it. So it was also, and that's very important, this question of the political shift in knowledge that occurs with that. The problem with that is, as Boyle quickly found out, it is very difficult to replicate. First of all, there's a lot of equipment involved there, and who has access to the equipment, and then it never actually worked. I mean, it was really, really difficult. So Boyle thought there's got to be another way, there's got to be something better than this. And this is how he came up with the idea of virtual witnessing. This is a term that he coined. And with virtual witnessing, you get a division of roles. You get those people who will replicate, and then you get many others, a multiplicity of witnesses who will not actually replicate, who will not actually see the experiment themselves, but who will be virtual witnesses to it. This was the idea that he had come up with, which was the precursor of the Royal Society, was this idea of the invisible college. So the people that are not directly there, but who are your invisible college, they're around you. And nowadays, of course, that term invisible college is used for a citation network. So there's some interesting things that are still coming through from this major imprinting of modern science through the notion of virtual witnessing. Now, what you wanted to get the assent of many. You know, the idea was that you would get universal assent. You had to create a multiplicity of witnesses in order for your scientific fact to get established. And in principle, the idea that would be that it was going to be all men. And men, the fact that this was men was not trivial. So you had to have the material technologies for your experiments, which you can see there in the diagram, and then you had to have a way of talking about it that would create this universal assent. And that's an example, and it's a lovely example of the kinds of discourse that was seen, that was thought, and it was also a very big and important discursive shift here. The kind of discourse that would allow this kind of assent at a distance, a virtual assent, a virtual witnessing. You had to, so there was a whole mode of putting across what you had seen to describe the experiment, and there are many different factors here. I'm taking here from work by Chapin and Schaefer on the history of the air pump. So you had various means of displaying your trustworthiness. You had to display your diligence and also your modesty. You had to. There was also, in order to get across this idea of that you can trust me, there was a lot of detail. So that's what you see in this example here. Really a lot of detail, a lot of circumstantial detail brought in. And lastly, you had to have a way of managing your disputes, which is quite an interesting thing that is built into the discourse. And we see that now in new publication practices. So just very quickly, we were then, once again, in terms of what is the impact of this on the scholarly research, that the long-standing impact of this on scholarly research has been that reproducibility and replicability, as we're talking about it today, are really the expressions of a deeper idea, and that deeper idea is a witness. That we have to have ways, you know, we're talking about universality, but actually what's really important here are communities and cultures. And here I'm drawing on social studies of science, which show the extent to which what is witnessed, you know, what can be assented to, depends on sharing theoretical frameworks, sharing technologies and instruments, sharing tacit knowledge, because it is not at all, there are no, you know, it's just like recipes, just like cooking, just like baking a cake. Actually, even following a recipe doesn't mean that you're going to get the cake that you were dreaming of at the end of it. There's a lot of tacit knowledge, and that tacit knowledge is embedded in epistemic cultures. And there's a lot of institutional structures around it, political, economic institutions, and access to resources. So you have the questions about who can witness and who can give witness. It is important that in the first, that qualification, all men, was really important. It was a way of excluding. So sometimes we think that we're being universal, but we're actually being very local, and we don't notice that. And of course, the question of access to resources is a very important aspect of that is still being played out in scholarly research that we're now seeing. So, what kinds of changes to scholarly publication might we be looking at in terms of the new infrastructures for publication? And in terms of that initial notion of witnessing that we saw, well, first of all, yeah, we can talk about reproducible, replicable, transparent, and we will talk about the meanings of those terms, but we have to keep in mind the question, for whom? For whom is it going to be any of these things? And we might want to be thinking in terms of networks, of placing data within networks, rather than in placing data so that it can be reproduced by others, but rather data so that it can be linked up to other data sets. We have to get better at making explicit the hidden aspects of knowledge by production, so that we are able to bring forward this aspect of communities and cultures around scientific knowledge. Scientific knowledge is not universal, it is very localized, and we have to find a way of bringing that forward. We have to understand by what means do we bring forward these hidden aspects of knowledge, and to what extent can we bring them forward. And we also have to be vigilant over the power structures involved in knowledge production, and to understand with any mode of publication, with any mode of communication, some are included, some are excluded, how do we handle that? How do we bring that to the fore? How do politics play themselves out? One of the ways in which we know that this plays itself out in the publication is that there's a privilege in publication of new results, and a marginalization of negative results or of replication. That's a way in which, that's a socioeconomic aspect of publication which skews scientific results. So we have to be vigilant of that. We have to get better at pushing that forward into the domain of visibility of scholarly publication.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks very much, Anna. So the way we're going to structure this, rather than, and I hope this isn't unfair to the earlier speakers, but rather than taking questions from each individual speaker, we're going to try to sort of zip through these and allow as much time as possible for sort of group panel discussion. Right. So, Anna Maria Carusi, just a moment. So our next speaker is Ian Hernashkovitz. And if I can just figure out, I never use these things. Yes, PowerPoint, sorry. Please. And Ian is, if I'm correct, you're responsible for Nature Scientific Data, among other things.
Is this on? No.
It should be the one to take this.
Okay. Yes, so I'm responsible for Nature Scientific Data and some other things as well, but I actually wanted to, well, firstly answer the question that was put to us in the first slide, and then talk a little bit more about, I suppose, some of the practicalities. I mean, there'll probably be further discussion about what reproducibility is and what it means, and what I've tried to think about, being, I think, the only publisher on the panel, is what it means practically for scholarly communication now or tomorrow. So firstly, this idea of should we be aiming for reproducibility or transparency? So I've taken more of a pragmatic position. I mean, both are hard, and both aren't universal at the moment. Transparency is increasing. There's more open access articles and data, but there's certainly significant effort required to have more transparency in lots of more of the products of research, not just papers, but data and code and protocols. But more transparency should, I would hypothesize, and I don't know how you could test this, but most would probably agree that transparency should naturally lead to more innovation in how we can assess the validity, the reproducibility of scientific research. I also think that when we're talking about transparency, we're also talking about openness in the context of licenses and having the right license on content, whether it's Creative Commons attribution licenses for papers or public domain waivers, Creative Commons CC0 for data. Those are all important in terms of actually rapidly and more efficiently enabling research to be reproduced. I'm guessing Victoria may talk a little bit more about licenses, maybe not, but anyway, if you haven't, just Google her work on it, it's a good read. yeah, I think all of this transparency will enable us to actually better assess which of the publications, which of the research outputs are reproducible. And there's some interesting examples of that already in place. And just so for my second slide, and apologies to anyone who's heard this sort of bad attempt at a joke already. So I tried to think about what are the different roles that publishers can play in increasing the reproducibility of research. So what are the principles of reproducibility for publishers? What are the pillars of reproducibility? And I tried to come up with an acronym that almost said pillar, but not quite. So I'll explain what these words mean with a few examples. It's just how I structured it was my thought process at the time, and you could organize these in whichever way you like. But content. So for publishers, enabling research to be more reproducible, it's about publishing not just what we publish, but the format in which we publish it. So, for example, you need to have detailed methodological information in papers, otherwise scientists can't understand what was done and reproduce it. But it's also about the format of the content. So, not just publishing PDFs, but publishing HTML and XML as well. If anyone who's read some of the very early discussions, the common pieces about building PubMed and PubMed Central, it was always central to the idea of building a GenBank for the literature, so the literature was supposed to be a resource for science itself. So that's a role publishers can play in content that enables more reproducible research. Policies is about editorial and publishing policies, and critically how they are enforced. Many journals have policies on data sharing as a condition of publication, or you have to include a link to this database or that database. But it has to be about how those are enforced, and that does take time and it does take resources, but it is something that publishers have an important role in. Incentives. So this is about data citation quite often, and this is we had some really interesting discussions about that at the BioCuddy workshop yesterday. So incentives I think that's key, but also different types of content as well. So we've got software papers people have talked about today. We've got data papers, the kind of papers that are publishing scientific data, and various other data journals that were emerging. Licenses I've mentioned, and obviously publishers are key there as well. Accessibility is about providing links, so joining up not just the papers, but with their underlying data, underlying software, and making sure that that's all easily available from a reuser's perspective of the literature. And finally, reliability, I'm talking about peer review, so not just coordinating peer review, but actually ensuring that it's appropriate for the type of content that's being considered. So having peer review that's focused on data, for example, is really important. There are numerous examples of journals that have policies or procedures that enable these things. There's a journal called Biostatistics that has an associate editor for reproducibility that gives a kite mark to papers depending on if they can access the code and the data or reproduce the results. So really to sum up, I think there are lots of practical things that reproducibility means for publishers, and to misquote someone else, the future's really already here, it's just unevenly distributed.
Okay, Chris, your turn. So I introduce Chris Drummond from the National Research Council of Canada.
Thank you very much. So I'm the sort of joke speaker. I'm going to suggest why I think the whole idea is wrong. So I'm trying to make an argument for what I've called a dissenting opinion for reproducible research. The term dissenting opinion comes from the Supreme Court of the US. And what you imagine is you have a whole slew of judges, and if there's not a unanimous decision, there's a majority opinion, and then the people who don't agree give a dissenting opinion. Out of curiosity, it's also, the other synonym for this is minority report. So all those who seen the film will know what the origin is. My concern with reproducible research in some ways is that it's been so successful. The movement's been so successful. It is changing the face of the topics we study. And that worries me. And I hope I can convince you enough to give you a pause for a moment, at least a pause for reflection. I can't imagine that what I'm going to say is going to stop the movement. One thing that's problematical is I suspect different people have different ideas of what reproducible research really is and what it means to them. And I try to distill out what I think are primarily two things. Certainly the ones that hit me in the face when I read them. So, well, I suppose I should be pressing the buttons, you know. It's me. So the two arguments I think for reproducible research are these. The first one is that it is and has always been an essential part of science. Now it's interesting, the term itself is a relatively modern vintage, but like with the prior speaker, there's the belief that nevertheless the practice went on, has gone on for a long time. In fact, one might say that's the definition of it being an essential part of science, is that it's been in common practice. If it hasn't been in common practice, then is it an essential part of science? And the corollary of that is the idea that not doing so is simply bad science. And I think there's an implicit ad hominem in there that if you're not doing it, you're a bad scientist. Now, why do I think that people are saying this? Well, there's a phrase that I've seen countless times. If you go to the internet and look up cornerstone of science, you will find, preferably in quotation marks, you'll find the most common use of that phrase is to do with reproducible research. So what are they saying, the cornerstone of science? They're not saying it's a part of science. They're not saying it's sometimes used in science. They're not saying it's useful in a few sciences. They're saying it is essential for science itself. Now, the second part of the argument, which is perhaps strongly connected to this first part, is the idea of the scientific method. This is taught in schools, it's taught to students. It's the idea, some people say that science isn't a collection of facts, it's a way of doing things. And the point here is that science, the argument is that science is inherently incremental. We take one person's results and we build on it. And so if we don't have reproducibility, progress science. So you may well agree with these arguments so far. So I'm going to try to suggest why they might not be totally true. And the counter-argument is reproducibility, at least in the form that's been proposed. I could argue there is a form which I would accept as some form of reproducibility, but certainly the way it's being presented is not now, nor has it ever been, an essential part of science. So the example I give in a paper is some work trying to prove that the speed of light was finite. And the point of coming to the acceptance of the speed of light as finite needed experiments of very different types. So in fact, the sort of verification of a scientific idea wasn't by precisely duplicating the same experiment. In fact, it's not clear what effect that would have. The whole point of trying to verify scientific ideas or scientific facts, to use the term one of the early speakers used, is to look at it from very different angles. So that, if anything, I might accept as scientific reproducibility, but not this very narrow idea of exactly duplicating the experiment. And that's what's being asked for. We want your code, we want your data, so we can do it exactly the same. I don't believe that that's historically true. I don't think anybody really attempted that, but I see no reason why we should do it now. I think anybody who's looked at the philosophy of science will understand that the whole idea of a well-defined scientific method is highly debatable. Certainly for the days of sort of Polanyi and Kuhn, the idea that iterative, simple iterative science is very naive, and that we don't just simply build up things. Some philosophers like Barry Robin would argue that there is nothing in a methodology. But if you don't like philosophers, or you don't believe them, or you think they shouldn't tell you what to do in science, many scientists would equally say the same thing. I quote one in the paper which basically says that anything goes in science. There is no single methodology. And it certainly isn't, I think, and obviously so, that you do an experiment, I take your experimental result, and I tweak them a bit. That just doesn't seem to me to be science at all. Thank you.
Okay, so next we're going to hear from Thomas Steckler, who works, as I said, at Janssen.
Thanks, Tim. As Tim mentioned, I'm a neuropsychopharmacologist, in fact, a behavioral pharmacologist, work for pharmaceutical industry. And as a preamble, I should say that for us, data are key, and what we really look is data that we can then translate into further development of drugs. So we are relying on the data that we either generate ourselves or that we find in the literature, in publications, or through other communication means. And of course, as Tim also mentioned, there has been quite some worries around the reproducibility of those data that are in the literature. He mentioned Beckley and Alice, but there are several other publications around as well, highlighting the issue that reproducibility is rather low. And of course that has implication in terms of money, that has implication in terms of hands that are needed to try and replicate, that has implications in terms of compounds going to the market and eventually to the patient. So there is a serious consequence of non-reproducible data. That's not a single case for one single company. It's something that is an issue that is faced by many other companies, and not only by companies, but also by a lot of academic groups, certainly in the area of neuroscience, in the area of pharmacology. Because of that, we've taken an initiative to set up a network for data reproducibility that was launched recently in October last year, and it's related to the European College of Neuropsychopharmacology, ECNP. It's a network of different interest groups, also including publishers, including grant-giving bodies and others, to really try and tackle the issue of data reproducibility. Now, when it comes to good scientific practice, and I'm more simplistic in my number of pillars here, I'm only looking at three. One, clearly for me, is reproducibility, but the others are robustness of the data and relevance of the data you're generating. And I think all three are really intimately related to each other, as you will see in a second. The question we were asked to tackle in our briefing initially was, should scholarly research aim for reproducibility or something else? And I would like to argue, and that goes a bit along the same lines as the previous speaker argued, that possibly it's not necessarily reproducibility per se that is a key issue at hand here, but it's the robustness of data we need to focus on. If you look at the definition of reproducibility, and there's certainly different definitions around, one certainly I like is that it's the ability of an entire experiment, and the experiment could be part of a study, of course, or a study to be reproduced, and, as it was also indicated in the previous presentation, pretty close to the original publication. So ideally, you have a point-by-point methodological alignment to reproduce what's in the publication. Robustness of data is slightly different. You can define it as a characteristic describing a finding that can be detected under a variety of different test conditions, and that also goes along what the previous speaker talked about. Now, what you can then say is that if you have a robust concept, you should be able to detect that under these different conditions, and you don't need, in fact, this point-by-point replication. I would even like to argue that robust finding is much more relevant, certainly from a biological point of view, because it can be detected under a variety of conditions, not just under one specific experimental design. So robustness of data, in my view, are key, because if you have robust data, I believe that reproducibility follows from that. I would further like to argue that if you have a study that aims at replication, what you in fact do is not looking at replication, but you look at the robustness of the published data, because it's inherently difficult to really have your point-by-point replication. There are a lot of unknown factors that are not mentioned in the methods. There are a lot of unknown factors that are not even under the conscious awareness of the author, I would argue. So it's very difficult to really reproduce what's published. What you really try to do is to figure out in an experiment how robust the published findings are. Now, when you look at the data and ask the question, what in fact makes data robust, there are a couple of criteria that you can find, and there's a rationale for these different criteria, and I believe also implications then for what we would like to see in the publication. And I don't go through the whole list in the interest of time, but just to highlight a few. I believe that you have to start with a meaningful sample procedure. So your test system has to be geared up to the question you really like to answer. You have to have data that are reliable, so you want to have consistency in your findings across different experimental conditions. You have to look at a proper baseline from which you can compare to, and you want to have a limited bias. And bias could be at the side of the experiment, could be at the side of the author writing up the paper, but could also, of course, be at the side of the referee that favors, I believe, a lot of publications that go along with his or her own hypothesis, much more than contra data, and could also be at the side of the editors and the publishers, because at the end what they want possibly is high impact, sexy science, rather than negative results or failure to prove a hypothesis. And I'll leave it with that. There are other things we can possibly discuss later in the discussion.
So our next speaker is Professor Stodden. Yet another take.
Great. Well, it's a real pleasure to be here, and I'm very lucky actually to go second last and be able to build on all the contributions that have been said already today. So I wanted to talk about 3 types of reproducibility. So one of the main things that I research is reproducibility, and I have found it a helpful framework to try and sort of think about this in terms of 3 types of reproducibility. And for me, that's been very helpful, is sort of making this discussion around this and what our next step should be more intellectually coherent. So, okay, that's the first slide. So in unpacking this term reproducibility, I think it's been useful for me to think about empirical reproducibility, or what I call empirical reproducibility, as one type of reproducibility that's important in science and in thinking about responses to all this discussion of irreproducibility. I'll just interject at this point that some people use the word reproducibility in certain ways, some people use the word replicability, and we've already heard sort of other terms, mostly for some reason starting with R, coming out in this discussion. The way that I think about reproducibility is really, can you follow the exact steps that someone else went through to get the results? Meaning, can you really understand what they've done in their experiment, whether it's on the bench, whether it's in a computer? Can you actually follow their sort of cognitive trace through to get their results? And then the way that I use the word replicability is whether you can take sort of the spirit of their experiment and re-implement this independently, whether that involves stepping through, steps at a wet lab, or whether that means, recoding this in software, and then end up with substantially similar results. And I think this idea of whether or not results are substantially similar or different is incredibly important, and we're just starting to sort of think about what this means, and I'll return to that at the end of my few minutes. Okay, empirical reproducibility. So what I mean by this is traditional reproducibility. So what Dr. Carusi mentioned with Robert Boyle's attempts to replicate experiments that were being done with the air pump, and did you have enough information in what was written down to actually physically go through these sort of physical aspects of the experiment itself? So this would be, say, for example, a biology experiment when you're adjusting protocols and you're really doing things with reagents and with cells and so on, and you've got a physical process here. So that's really what Boyle was talking about in the 1660s. What were we physically doing as scientists? And can I tell you about that as part of this sort of virtual witnessing that happens through the publication process? So I think this has been a large part of our discussion. So can I actually physically go through and replicate your experiment? I think it's very helpful to separate that type of reproducibility from what I've been calling computational reproducibility. So I think of a computational scientist in a very broad sense. If you use a computer anywhere in your work, possibly except sort of article drafting, but anywhere in the scientific work, I would call you a computational scientist. So that means maybe even someone on the bench is collecting data and then they enter it into their computer and do some statistical tests, for example. I would call that a computational scientist. So somehow the computer's been used in generating those scientific results that are now trying to be communicated to the community. So computational reproducibility, I think of that as separate from empirical reproducibility, A, because it's new. This is something we've been really kind of using as a regular tool in scientific investigation for about 20 years, maybe, not something that's gone back to the 1660s. So this is really, I think, when we grapple with these issues of reproducibility, and there's been so much discussion today about data, about software, and all of these items that were never part of the communications. I mean, basically, we sort of communicate just like we did at the beginning of the philosophical transactions, where we write something up and we give you this, I mean, now it's a PDF, but we sort of give you this document. And what happened to data and to code and these things that I would need to verify, step-by-step verify what you've done. And the reason we need that step-by-step verification, whether it's on the bench or whether it's in a computational aspect, is because if I go ahead and I do that replication and do that independent re-implementation of your experiment, and I'm looking for supporting evidence or counter evidence or whatever it is, I'm going to get something different. Particularly in the computational aspects, I'm definitely going to get something different if I re-implement this myself. How do we reconcile these differences? The only way to do it is if I can also reconstruct step by step what you've done, and I understand how we've made this different, and how we've done different scientific steps to get to these results, whether they're material, maybe I'm wrong, you're right, whatever it is, but we started to be able to understand what those intellectual steps were that got us to the result. We're not going to be able to reconcile those differences unless we can also unpack a replication reproducibly. Okay, the final category that I found useful for thinking about issues around reproducibility is what I've been calling statistical reproducibility. So this is elements in design of experiments, in power. Do you have enough sample? Have you done your sampling randomly? Tim mentioned at the beginning false positives creeping into the literature, negative results, all of these aspects of statistical inference on your data. Now, these have computational components. Have you implemented the test correctly in the program, for example, that you're going to run on your data and so on? There's certainly overlap. But I think statistical reproducibility is another dimension of reproducibility that can cause you do poor statistics, you do the wrong types of tests, and you can end up with results that are irreproducible, whether they've been done independently or whether you're trying to step through and copy. Okay, so, right. I wanted to just come back to this notion of the scientific method and why we even have something like the scientific method. The reason we have this is error is everywhere in everything we do. Back to Boyle's virtual witnessing, the reason that we're trying to communicate all these aspects of our experiment is I'm trying to convince the community that I've done everything I can to root error out of the process that got me onto those results that I think are worth actually presenting out to the community. So if you think about branches of the scientific method, traditionally there were two: deductive branch, mathematics, logic, an inductive branch, which actually goes back to 1660s and all this discussion of the invisible college and induction. And we think about, well, what are the communication standards with those first two branches, or those two branches of the scientific method? If you have a mathematical result, you don't publish this to the community without the proof. They've got a well-established standard for what it takes to validate, verify these communicated results. In the empirical branch, or inference, mostly what traditional science has been engaged in, we have this machinery of hypothesis testing, appropriate statistical methods, as I mentioned. And then we have, you don't publish leaving the methods section blank. You won't get your paper accepted because we need to be able to see what steps you've actually taken to get through to that final conclusion. Now, all of you have probably heard all this chatter about a third branch of the scientific method, a fourth branch of the scientific method, how simulation is giving us a third branch of big computation and high-performance computing, and data-driven discovery giving us a fourth branch potentially. What I think a lot of the discussion around reproducibility is, how do we elevate things like simulation or data-driven discovery, two branches of the scientific method? We need to come up with these comparable standards that the first and second branches actually have. As I mentioned, we've had 20 years to start thinking about this. It's nothing compared to 1660. But really, so what are our standards for delivering you a computational result such that I can convince you or have this virtual witnessing and get closer and closer to the truth? And I argue that we need to be able to follow the steps what you did. We need independent replications to try and add strength and evidence to that result. And so I found it useful to parcel thinking about reproducibility into these empirical aspects, computational aspects, and statistical aspects in thinking about how we go forward and how we actually deliver these reproducible scientific results to the community. I think that's what I have. I'll finish with one quote. So this is my advisor, David Donahoe, my PhD advisor, paraphrasing John Claerbout, who's another Stanford professor, talking about really reproducible research, and they say, the idea is an article about computational science. Now remember, I'm defining that as any time you've used a computer. An article about computational science in a scientific publication is not the scholarship. It's merely advertising of the scholarship. The actual scholarship is a complete set of instructions and data that generated the tables and figures in your paper. Okay.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Victoria. And, we're very pleased to have Professor Bernard Silverman here as well, from Oxford University of Oxford.
Yes, I'm not really from Oxford at all, but I live here and I have 3 non-visiting appointments. So I'm the government's Home Office Chief Scientific Advisor, but I have known David Donahoe for about 35 years, including when he was an undergraduate, actually. So that was quite. Oh yes, I'll tell you later. Okay, and whether that was yeah. So the reason I'm here is because I've recently become the chair of the UK Research Integrity Office, which is a sort of voluntary organisation which universities sign up to, which thinks about questions of research integrity and which provides advice and training and thought leading all around the research integrity agenda. So that's the reason I'm here. I'm a statistician by original training, and I've worked in all different kinds of areas. Now, what I wanted to talk about was, what does ethical research look like? I've also got some comments. It's great coming last because I've got some comments on the other speakers. I would say that from an ethical point of view, assent and witnessing requires trust, and trust and networks require an ethical framework. And there was a lot about power structures. I might not agree about whether all men was exclusive or inclusive, but the point is there are always power structures in every organisation, every way we do things, and ethics are, if you like, an agreed way of negating the negative aspects of power structures, or good ethics should be. I'll talk to my bullet points in a minute. And I also thought that the point about the typology of reproducibility is essential. And in everything I'm going to talk about, we might think underneath it about how there are different kinds of reproducibility. So reproducibility may not be itself an absolute thing, but we'll come to that. Okay, so what does ethical research look like? I've given you the whole book, the whole talk. There's only one slide, so you have to go at 6, don't worry. So what is ethical research like? It's accurate, it's honest, it's safe, it's legal, it's accountable, and it's transparent. So those are some adjectives that I hope are mostly okay. I might add that if anyone here has had a heart transplant, you wouldn't be able to have one if it wasn't for the work of Christian Barnard, which probably doesn't satisfy any of those 6 adjectives, does it? Because he
reproducible. It appears to be
well, yeah. Although what he did was absolutely illegal, because he did it transgressed virtually every form of ethics there was. And I remember hearing, and this is actually quite interesting because it may actually refer to Chris's thing, which is that I remember hearing him interviewed on the radio, and he stated, "Why did you go into heart surgery?" And he said, "Well," he said, "I'm a very egotistical person, and I like to see results. And the things about the sort of heart surgery I do is that either you get immediate results, either the patient dies, or it gets much better." And I remember that made tremendous effect on me. In fact, in many of his early cases, both things happened. But as a result, many people have been. Okay. Another thing about ethical research is it should not be overstated, it should not be misrepresented, and it should not be sloppy. And so some of the sorts of things that Chris was talking about are fine, I would guess. It's when people overstate the importance of what they've done, we find that unethical. We find that bad. We find the idea that you should suddenly pretend that you've done a lot more than you have, or you misrepresent what you've done, or you've been sloppy. If we get to Mendel's work on genetics in the 19th century, as you know, it wasn't accurate or honest. It was sort of transparent. Legal, it was only beans, not a problem. And yet it was right, of course. It's true. And that actually gives you pause. I suppose the way I'd like to reduce reproducibility in an ethical framework is this. If you are reproducible, it's a welcome way of assuring many of the ethical issues. It's a bit like saying, I suppose, if you drive within the speed limit, you are more likely to drive safely, but it doesn't imply you necessarily will. But having a speed limit is one way of helping you drive safely, if you like, and reproducibility is a welcome way of helping you behave in an ethical way. And it's not a panacea, because whatever your exact ethical notions, explicit reproducibility, I think, or one of the forms that Victoria mentioned, is a good way of assuring of meeting your ethical aspirations. So if we abandon reproducibility, and if we say, well, it's Wild West, anything goes, then I think we need to have very clear and explicit ethical guidelines to replace it. You might say, why do we need written ethical guidelines at all? After all, we live here in a country that doesn't have a written constitution, and we get on well without, or we don't want a written constitution. Actually, we have different sort of written constitution. But the reason is, of course, that in a large community, or the larger the community becomes, the more difficult it is for things just to be unspoken. And that's, I think, why. So students need to be told what's right and what's wrong. Editors of journals need to be told, actually, what you're doing is not right, it's not ethical. People used to think that just publishing their own articles in journals is reasonable. We don't think it is, and so on. So I think that science isn't unusual or unique in that many of its ethics are unwritten. But the question I'd like us to bear in our minds is reproducibility a step in codifying what may often be unsaid? Or does it hamper the progress of imaginative discovery? Reflecting on the talks we just heard, one of the other notes I made was about transparency. If you had full transparency, would that satisfy all the same ethical things that I said? Would full transparency have exactly the same thing? I suspect that one of Victoria's definitions of reproducibility would be the same as full transparency. And we're playing with words in some ways in placing transparency over against reproducibility. And I'd also suggest we're playing with words in placing robustness over against reproducibility. I think they're much the same thing. My final shot is this. In my day job, one of the things I do is if anyone here, does anyone here do animal experiments? Yes, in this country. If you do animal experiments in this country, you have to hold a license. And if you hold a license, I issue it, or I don't, but someone that works for me does. Well, actually, sorry, the Secretary of State issues it on our advice. And now, here's a thing I realized. If someone did a completely reproducible animal experiment and published it, I would not allow someone else to repeat it. So in fact, reproducibility means you don't have to reproduce it. In fact, I wouldn't allow you to reproduce it, because it would be a waste of animals to reproduce an already conducted experiment. So there's an interesting thing to go away with. An advantage of reproducibility is you don't have to reproduce it. If it's not reproducible, then you have to try to reproduce it to see if it was right or not in the first place. Thank you.
So now we're going to let Anna Maria bail out. And thank you very much for your contribution. Right. So I think we'd like to just put a few questions to the panel, but maybe, Melissa, shall we just take questions from the audience first, or did you have something you want?
Yeah,
I
I guess let's start taking questions,
Right.
and then we'll kind of chime in.
We have some
I'm working on it. I'm working on it.
If we know how to do it, we'll do
We're
it.
just trying to figure that out.
Lighting control,
Let's see.
if full, medium, it is medium. Okay, there we go, good. Well done, well done.
Is that okay? All right.
Good, okay. So, questions. Marianne? No?
Japanese over there.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Want me to yell it? Here's the mic.
So bringing it back to why we're all sort of in this room, I think the discussion was great and very nuanced. And I think we all agree we cannot shackle research with some huge chains that interfere with creativity or overly increase the cost of every single experiment or unnecessarily kill animals that don't need to be killed. And it's really been that these sort of conversations go on, but that new technology is allowing us different ways of understanding that these conversations are going on. So that little hidden, oh, everybody knows, that doesn't work, has to be made public in some way. I also heard a great statement at a conference I was at once, I think it was the Needed Award, where they said something like, the Journal of Biological Chemistry is true but not interesting. Nature is interesting but not true. And I was at an NIH workshop on reproducibility, and the suggestion was that one of the part is hard is that you cannot attach all these different articles that talk about different things into one location. It's very difficult to pull together this, and that discussion happens over many years, and so a lot of damage gets done before anybody understands what sort of mistakes were made. And one suggestion was that the Science and Nature's and high impact journals of the world have to take ownership of the articles that they publish, and so that they therefore need to publish the follow-up articles and the ones that might call into question and what have you, that they cannot cede that off to some place where it cannot be connected. And since I know we at least have one person from Nature up there, I was wondering what people thought of that idea, because I was intrigued by it.
First.
Well, I think we had a question posed directly to Nature, didn't we? Yeah.
Well, anybody can comment on it.
Yeah, but let him do it first. Did you put him on the spot?
Well, the question was, should journals that publish research which is later found to be questionable or has errors, should they publish a follow-up, or should
even
they?
Any follow-up, right? So they follow up if it's been reproduced, whether it's exact methods or not, or if it hasn't been reproduced. You don't see those in Nature and Science, right? You see them someplace else.
So a great example, I give you a great example of that. The infamous Obokata stem cell paper, right? Which Nature seemed to have accepted without too much trouble. And as we know, Riken published, did an investigation and so forth. But why did they do the investigation? Because actually, a lot of people tried to reproduce that experiment because they thought it was such a cool technique, and all the discussion went on blogs, right? And if you look on the blogs where the evidence was posted that she had photoshopped her gels, that went right into the Reichen report, right? But it wasn't conducted on the journal that published the results, right? So I kind of think there might be some responsibility, like Marianne said, for them to allow or facilitate in a very good way people following these things up. I tend to agree with you, Marianne. Barely ever do, although she did.
In that case.
Yes, they held the gun door head more or less.
Sure.
Yes.
Well, in terms of general procedure and editorial and ethical publishing policies, we're all aware that there are corrections and retractions and statements of concerns and those things. Any sensible journal adheres to those kind of practices. In terms of finding space for studies which may be perceived to be less interesting, either officially or unofficially, the vast majority of publishers have many journals with different levels of selectivity, like them or loathe them. And many publishers are, in fact, trying to publish all sound research, whether it's a negative finding or whichever term that you use. So if a paper is methodologically rigorous, then whether it was published in another journal by the same publisher, most publishers would be vying to publish anything that's reasonable science.
But I think that's different than being able to track that fact. So if somebody happens to see it or they read their reference managers or whatever, but they may read the Nature paper, they may never see it in Journal X. And that's the problem, right, is to try to bring those things together more cohesively. I don't care where it's published, but right now the Natures don't take responsibility for that thing over there. They go, oh, you guys go publish it, or it goes into a mega journal. It's fine, it needs to be in there, but it needs to be very strongly linked back.
Having open access content enables, I'm losing count of the number of tools now that are aggregating papers and finding related papers and papers that are inextricably or just related to others, and having more open access to research enables that kind of barrier to be much lower, to find the papers that are related or corrections or whichever.
Right. This is Professor Silverman.
Yeah. I actually find retraction a problem, because if something's retracted, it ceases to exist. And maybe what one wants is it's sort of worse than that. It's, I don't know what the word would be, sort of condemnation or something. Because because the interesting thing is that if an article is, if something is found not to be so, then work has gone into the fact that it has been so found, and if you retract it, it just disappears, and that's not what you want. What you want is, you want to be able to know that was done. It sometimes does, different journals do it in different ways. I think the other thing is to understand that now and again things will be published which if the experiment is reproduced in one of the ways that Victoria mentioned, you will get a different result. And that's inevitable. Whereas the sort of simulation experiments that David Donner and I have done in our work, actually the idea is you will not get a different result, because you can exactly carry out the same calculations and so on. And finally, having edited a mathematics journal myself, mathematical reviewers actually reproduce the research in order to review the paper, which is why it takes years sometimes to get a rep. But they'll actually go through every single step and check it. In other words, they'll actually reproduce the work themselves. And I tried to persuade people as referees not to do that, because it meant it was years until things were published. And I said, look, in the end, if it looks about right and it's interesting, we'll publish it. And then if it turns out to be wrong, they'll have to retract it later. So I think there's a very nuanced discussion around this. But in the end, I actually think that modern internet tools and so on, surely it's not necessary to clutter up journals too much with large amounts of follow-up.
I'll give you my point of view on that part of the discussion as well. I fully agree with you to start with, because I think it's a major issue that these negative results or failures to replicate are not published in the same journal. And I would say that a lot of the reason for that is that people drop the impact factor by hosting all these non-reproducible papers. And this is a strong driving force behind it. If you have a student that is looking for some results, he will look into the high-impact, shiny journals. And he will possibly not see that one little report that's hidden somewhere in an obscure journal with a low impact factor. Let's be real about this. And because of that, you will also see that a lot of authors don't even bother to try and publish these negative data, because it is a high hurdle to get them published. And if they publish them, then they publish them in a journal where impact is low, and that means that it impinges on their career.
William, and then Ivan, and then I'll get to Theodore.
Okay, yeah. So I'll be fairly brief with this and try to make this short. So I've introduced myself as Representative Mendeley. Many of you may know I'm also involved in the Reproducibility Project, Reproducibility Initiative. And we found some interesting things in terms of our definition of reproducibility. So doing exactly the same thing again does help sometimes flesh out those unknown hidden variables that prevent things from being exactly replicated from lab to lab, which is important science in and of itself. And then multiple experiments together may not change the finding, but they may change the significance of the finding. So, maybe it is unethical to add more animals to an experiment that has already been done, but you don't know how many times that experiment was done and not published. So it's a lot more unethical, I would argue, to let something proceed into clinical trials when it has not been properly vetted. And so, the understanding of the file-drawer effect is very, very important for any of these kinds of discussions. And then lastly, I'd just like to respond to Ian's comment about let's get the data out there and maybe, and that will be good enough. And, well, I absolutely do not believe that just having the data out there will be good enough for people to reproduce stuff unless you're talking about purely computational results. There's no incentive in biology for people to go and do work that no one's going to publish anywhere, and if they do, it's not going to be a high-impact finding. So we actually had conversations with PLOS One. They didn't want to publish our reproducibility studies because they couldn't find reviewers that could properly review a replication versus a novel result. So, it's very, very difficult for researchers to do this.
That isn't the reason we didn't publish those.
We'll talk later.
It wasn't.
Yeah, I wasn't sure that I said just getting the data out there is enough for reproducibility, if that's how it came across. I'll try and clarify. I think what I was trying to make a point is having the data openly available is a pragmatic baby step towards enabling research to be reproduced independently if it's deemed to be necessary. In terms of places, motivations to publish negative results, or whichever term that you prefer for them, having previously been publisher of a number of journals that have explicitly tried to receive negative results and seen much discussion over the last 5 years, my belief is it's actually people don't have the time or the motivation to want to publish them. There are so many journals that say they want to publish this stuff, but still it seems that not much of it is being submitted for peer review often.
Yeah, I think one problem, though, with this replication idea is the assumption there's no consequence to it. And the biggest problem I have with the whole reproducibility movement is there's apparently a lot of consequence to it. So, for instance, as a reviewer, what happens if we start to value the details of a paper? I think we will end up... So one worry I have is that I think the quality of reviewing has been going down over the years. And I think the problem is that we are overloading the reviewers. And one problem I have is what I call paper inflation, which is that people are publishing more and more papers, and the reviewers are forced to do less and less. And now somebody comes along and says, oh yes, well not only do you have to review the paper, you also have to review the data, and you have to run the code. And that worries me. And it worries me for two reasons. One is it will add to the load of reviewers and therefore degrade reviewing practice, which I think is a dangerous thing. But secondly, I think unfortunately as human beings, if we can find an easy way out to reject something, we'll take it. So if you've done something that says, well, you haven't quite, crossed the T or dotted the I, then we just simply reject it. I mean, I've seen this with statistical tests and things like that, where people get very picky on something. So generally it has a cost, and that's my concern. It may have value, but in my opinion, the value doesn't outweigh the cost.
Ivan.
I'm here.
Yes. Oh, that Ivan. Okay. Yeah.
So I am a little bit bothered by the discussion because I have at least the impression
that it is dominated by specific sciences, biophysics, etc. I am a mathematician by training. I'm a computer scientist. My world is very different. And I am not absolutely sure how this whole discussion translates into my world. And to give one example which is even, it goes beyond my area. Take the work done in an institution like the R&D centers of Google or Yahoo. They are doing damn good science. There is no way anybody can reproduce some of the things they do, simply because the data they rely on, A, is company property, so we have an access problem. B, it is so damn huge that nobody has the power to do the computation that some of those researchers do. And there are also legal issues, obviously, in some cases, privacy issues to access to those data. So I'm just not sure that the reproducibility is something that we can declare universally. And rather, we would have to look at various scientific areas and look at those issues a bit, place by place. Period.
Anyone want to speak to that? Yeah.
Okay, there's a number of issues that you raised in that question. So the first thing is, I think that mathematics, especially applied mathematics and implemented on computer systems, has as many, it needs to pay as much attention to reproducibility as other aspects. So this was one, I sort of tried to say some of that might fall in computational reproducibility. So we don't have standards on, so for example, what parts of software do you save, what's good coding in science, for example. Maybe this is something that's determined by a discipline, but we haven't had discussions about this. If you look at, say, for example, the open source software community, you wouldn't submit code without tests, for example. But we do all sorts of stuff in science that's, very sort of, wouldn't be up to the standards of open source science, for example. And so, what can we learn from them, or what's effective for science? It's all a discussion that we're just starting to have. I mean, I'm not saying those standards should just be put on us, but should we be thinking about what we're doing a little more, maybe? So I think there really is, and if you think about the role of computer science in data science, for example, they're probably about 80% of data science. And this is something with huge amounts of thinking about, well, what parts of the sort of data science pipeline do you capture at what point, and what workflow systems manage this, and what kind of virtual machines, for example, are necessary, or even maybe not necessary in terms of replication of computational aspects of work. These are whole areas of research that sort of popped up in the last 5 years or so. And you raised some policy issues around access to data and so on. So I published a co-edited book this year called Privacy, Big Data, and the Public Good. And one of the chapters in there, we deal with all these issues around privacy, around access, and so on. And one of the chapters is, well, how do we reconcile things like privacy or data that, for example, patients, you can't just share the data and make your work reproducible in the way that we've been talking about. But how do we innovate ways to query the data, for example, or sort of have authentication aspects, so that maybe we don't have everybody accessing the data, but we have sort of authenticated people who can access, and so there's some version of reproducibility. And there's all these kind of new issues that are coming up. So I think you're raising very important and difficult issues, but they're new, and I think there's an enormous amount of computer science research that could actually really advance reproducibility when you have that computational aspect to your work. Things like size and complicated hardware and computational infrastructure, they're difficult for reproducibility. But you also need to think about what level of abstraction are you operating at as a scientist. So if I'm doing something that really only works in my lab for me, is it really that useful? Is it really science, in a sense? So it's just, these are new discussions that we're having around what's the appropriate level of abstraction, and how do we expect our results to generalize. So it's just ways that we've been thinking about how do we actually sort of deliver these computational results, and what kind of goes with it, or should go with it, and in what context is what valuable. These are all new questions that we're grappling.
Very good.
I want to add actually to my animal experiment analogy, because I think we shouldn't confuse
theoretical reproducibility with actual reproducibility. So if I take the example of a clinical trial for a cancer drug, if you establish that in a clinical trial that the drug works, is better than the previous treatment, then it would be absolutely unethical to repeat that experiment. And yet, it still has to be reported in a reproducible way. So there's a sort of conceptual reproducibility, which, as I said before, does not mean you would necessarily ever reproduce experiment. And it's possible that some of your very big data science things fall into the same category, because you can't build another Large Hadron Collider. You know, you can't build the LHC again, you can't do Google's data again. Often you cannot actually reproduce it, but that doesn't mean you can't conceptually write it in such a way that it can be reproducible.
Just to make one more comment, so I was at a workshop last summer around the Exceed system, which is an NSF-funded system that is sort of middleware software that accesses high-performance computing and very sort of big, powerful machines on the grid. And one of the discussions that came out of this among these computational folks was, even if you can't reproduce, so for example, this like Large Hadron Collider, sort of very fast machine like Blue Waters at NCSA at Illinois, those are very sort of sophisticated and unique architectures, and you just don't sort of virtualize this machine and expect to reproduce this. And but on the other hand, so what those community members ended up sort of coalescing on is working as if someone's going to reproduce this, whether or not they are, in a sense, is immaterial, because that brings in not just better science, but transparency and so on. So these standards are not just, well, it's not practical, so I don't have to worry about it. Doing your work as a scientist as if it's going to be reproduced is a very, very important point, I think.
So I'll just remark that sounds a little bit like virtual witnessing. Does it not? Because you're saying you're doing it as if, right? If I can see very clearly that every step makes complete sense, right? Do I have to actually reproduce it? Only if maybe perhaps I want to reuse the technique to do something else, right? This is why Obokata's thing was discovered, really, because people thought, what a great technique, I'll just use that in my lab.
Tim, can I still say something? So I don't disagree with anything you say, but I still believe there is one element that I said, that what reproducibility means may depend on the discipline. I am not convinced at this point that everything can be translated in general to science. And again, in the case of computer science, when I don't know, if there's an algorithm to be checked, reproduced, as you could say, the approach among computer scientists would be much different. What you said, I produce a bunch of test results, and I want to see independent implementation. If they all produce the same thing, then it's okay. But this is something that you cannot reproduce in biology.
Right, you don't have to kill the computer to rerun it, right? Exactly. So do we have somebody else?
We have one last question. Theo up there.
Theo, and then we have to wrap it
And then we have to wrap it up.
give it to somebody. Yeah.
Theo Bloom from the BMJ.
Theo, yeah.
I'm afraid I'm looping back a little bit because of the... so this is to say, first of all, retractions absolutely do not erase the literature. That's really important, and neither do corrections. But I would say there's a question for all of us here about what's the best way to make sure that people reading it know that this is no longer considered a sound piece of work to build upon, or that this had this error, but now it's been corrected. We have to keep that track of things, so that's number one. Number two, journals and publishers who are shutting comment streams seems to me the worst possible outcome for this kind of aim that we have of building on the literature. You want the comment stream right there on the paper, and you want people to comment saying, we've published a follow-up, here it is. And the third is, and this is my personal bugbear, and I'm ready to be assaulted at the drink session on it, I personally think the proliferation of anonymous peer etc., people posting random things about papers somewhere other than on the paper itself and in a way that is hard to follow up is not the best way for us to be trying to produce reproducible, robust, whatever it is we're trying to do. We need to be open and courteous and have a discussion about these things, ideally where the paper is.
I just wanted to speak to your second point, which is one of the motivations for the comments in PubMed was actually reproducibility, like being able to say, you know, I've tried to reproduce this, here are issues, and so on. And so, that was, it just may be pertinent to this discussion that it really was these reproducibility aspects that actually sort of push this commenting method that's not anonymous, for example.
So I have a question. Just show of hands, how many in this audience have ever heard of the open annotation data model? All right. All right. So we don't have to tie comment streams directly to single journals, okay?
Yeah. We're about to wrap up.
This is not a representative group here.
There's about 100 hands up, so we have to, Dan was first. We need a comment stream. We really need to wrap up because we're going to do the demos and then it's time for a cocktail hour. So I just wanted to say I feel like there's a theme that came from all of your presentations and from many of the comments, and that is that we've kind of gone from back in the days of, you know, really detailed methods in our philosophical transactions days where we wrote down everything there was to write down. Those were actually much like the protocols that we keep in the lab in basic science research today that are never put in the literature anymore. And yet now we have these disconnected pieces which are either protocols or data papers or protocol papers and tweets and comments and blogs, and everything is kind of disconnected. And so I guess I would, you know, we have this open annotation model, but I would urge all of you to think about innovative strategies for connecting back the pieces that actually help us understand, you know, how to trust the science. Because really that's, at the end of the day, what we're getting after here is how do we trust the science.
Right, or I would say that scholarship will remind ourselves that scholarship is about the search for truth, not for the search for impact factors.
Hear, hear.
And with that, I'd like to thank our panel very, very much for coming, and especially for people like Chris who jumped into the fire.
And please continue this discussion during the cocktail hour. There's a lot to talk about.